예, 안녕하십니까. 오늘
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is the first day of the Korea Global Forum for Peace, and this is session 3-2. This session is titled Cooperative Governance Between South and North Koreas to Respond to Biosecurity Threats in the Korean Peninsula. I am the moderator of this session. I'm a professor at Seoul National University. And I'm also the Vice Director for the Institute for Unification and Peace Studies at SNU. I would like to briefly introduce our presenters for this session. We are joined by Professor Shin Sang-do, who is professor at the College of Medicine of SNU. He will be giving a presentation on building a health security system on the Korean Peninsula. Good afternoon. I am in emergency medicine at the College of Medicine at SNU, and I will be delivering a presentation on building a health security system on the Korean Peninsula.
And next to him, we have a professor from the College of Veterinary Medicine of Seoul National University, Professor Choi Kwang-suk. Hello, my name is Choi Kwang-suk, and I'm from the College of Veterinary Medicine, and I conduct research on epidemic diseases of farm animals, and my presentation is related to that. So I would like to talk about how we can build peace between the two Koreas based on bio.
And we are also joined by two discussants. Actually, we are joined by some very special guests. The first discussant is professor at Yonsei University College of Medicine, Professor John Linton. Good afternoon. I'm In Yo-han. I am a professor at the College of Medicine at Yonsei University, and I've been to North Korea 29 times to provide humanitarian assistance. And I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and I believe that this is a very good opportunity. I'm not sure how big an influence we will be able to wield, but I think that it is very significant that we are gathered here today to discuss this issue. Next is Professor Kim Sang-bae from Seoul National University. He is with the Political Science Department.
Hello, my name is Kim Sang-bae from the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Seoul National University. And a new threat is emerging. We call them the new security issues, and there are a diverse range of them. And among them, I am especially interested in the medical area. It gives you a great honor to take part in this session, and I hope to engage in fruitful discussions with you. Thank you.
Professor Kim Sang-bae is also the director of the Society of Political Science in Korea, so he's a very difficult guest to have, and so I would like to thank him once again. Again, the title of this session is Cooperative Governance Between the Two Koreas to Respond to Biosecurity Threats on the Korean Peninsula. We will invite the first presenter for the first presentation. His presentation is titled Building a Health Security System on the Korean Peninsula. As introduced, I'm Shin Sang-do, and I am currently with the College of Medicine, and I have a specialty in emergency medicine. And so I have conducted research on disaster medicine, and I train physicians on disaster medicine. In the concept of health security, establishing a governance system, establishing a system overall has been very limited because of the geopolitical conditions surrounding the Korean Peninsula. So I will take a look at the global health security agenda, how the agenda came about, and I will also talk about some of the topics that need to be dealt with in building a health security system and health security cooperation system. Ebola, SARS, MERS, COVID are all new infectious diseases. And these infectious diseases have arisen in high population areas with dense populations, and these are quite frightening infectious diseases. Infectious diseases have been around since the beginning of history, and they emerge in modern society. However, since 2000, every year we see more infectious diseases emerge, and they are more threatening every year. So there is an area called health security. Within the realm of sustainable development, the international community in the Human Development Report classified different types of security. And at the time, health security was considered the spread of deadly infectious diseases. And of course, biochemicals and an artificial attack using biochemical weapons was also included in health security issues. So you can see that on one hand, we have various different security issues that arise because of different causes in different sectors. Politics, military, and then you have what is going on globally, like climate change and environmental degradation. Anything that brings on continued destruction can be considered security issues. But today, we will focus on biological agents that bring upon infectious diseases that are like disasters. And when society cannot be maintained, then we can call this a disaster and a health security issue. Because this is a relatively new area of study, there are parts that are insufficient. We have many biological events that occur, for instance, COVID-19 pandemic. And the question is how we are going to respond as an international community. And the concept of global health security is how we are dealing with these questions at hand. And the KCDC, the US CDC, and the WHO, and other international organizations have been dealing with this theme of global health security. When a biological agent brings on a grave security threat, the important thing is to be able to prevent, detect, and respond to these biological threats. If you look at global health security around the world, you need equal social development, and global health security is also impacted by different factors in society, such as religion and culture. So when a new infectious disease occurs, the infectious disease itself is a problem. But another issue that aggravates the situation is that due to globalization, it's very difficult to contain the disease. And we see a rise of drug-resistant pathogens. And this is also a very severe risk. And the UN and other international agencies have come up with a global health security agenda. And the basic idea behind the global health security agenda is to gather international capacities to better respond to health securities. NGOs and civic organizations and private organizations and public organizations are taking part in the agenda. It was launched in 2014, and the agenda is working toward achieving certain goals. We have a permanent commission in place as well, and Korea is actually a member of a permanent steering committee. The basic idea is to prevent biosecurities, to detect at an early stage and respond appropriately to biosecurity threats. In order to prevent an infectious disease, you need to engage in immunization. You need to also ensure biosafety. And whether the biosecurity threat is natural or artificial, you also need a laboratory system to carry out accurate diagnosis, and you need real-time surveillance systems and solid reporting systems. And you also need to develop a workforce that can deal with a situation. And once a situation has occurred, you need to be able to have capable emergency operation centers to coordinate response. And you also need to link public health with law and other multi-sectoral institutions. And also, medical countermeasures and triage are all important in the response. With the emergence of COVID, we are seeing new concepts arise as well. For instance, the public is wearing masks, and they are also social distancing. Now we are seeing new or identifying and discovering new facts. For instance, how effective are masks and how effective is social distancing. In the late 1990s, the world recognized that biological agents can threaten the global community. In 2014, the Global Health Security Agenda was first proposed, and the Korean government at the time participated quite actively. And here you can see biosecurity is aimed to protect people from naturally occurring or intentionally or accidentally released pathogenic microbes. And again, emergency response management, early detection, accurate diagnostics is very important. And this was discussed in 2014 as well. But for whom this was for, and what level of security was needed to ensure security, and what are we protecting ourselves from, how much will it cost, and what kind of methods are we going to use, and what kind of approaches and strategies. The conceptual model to answer all these questions was not established. So social resources are planned. So there is a certain amount of social resources that is used to operate and run a society and country. But the resources were quite limited to expand or increase the resources needed for the global health security. And during the SARS epidemic, there was also an issue with inoculation. For instance, how early on are we going to secure the vaccinations? Because we do not have the legal and institutional grounds for such issues, we have gone through a lot of trial and error. And so sometimes you would see that the response was happening in line simultaneously with the legislation or institutions being established. And so there has been some chaos. And here you can see that one of the highest threats posed is, of course, new infectious diseases. and these are natural factors. Because new infectious diseases can paralyze a society and eat up its resources, new infectious diseases are now considered a serious biological threat. In the past, we were more experienced with political conflict and bioterrorism. So, in the past, bioterrorism is not as considered a threat compared to the past. And so when it comes to bioterrorism, there is a system in place, especially in the United States. But when it comes to natural biological threats, we do not see a system that is as solid. And the countries classify these threats using a different criteria. So you can see that the U.S. Health Department has its own classification, and Korea has its own classification as well. You can see that in Korea there are about 85 different types of legal communicable diseases, and the Act on Prevention and Management of Infectious Diseases, whenever a pandemic or endemic occurs, it goes through many revisions. And currently, the latest revision of this Prevention and Management of Infectious Diseases Act was in 2018. This kind of management and prevention is important to lessen the social economic cost of infectious diseases. And Korea was a chair of a steering committee for the Global Health Security Agenda, and the second convention of the Global Health Security Agenda was held in Seoul. And so we are contributing in this way. Many new infectious diseases, with the exception of MERS and Ebola, SARS especially, had come out of Asia because of the high population density and whatnot. And secondly, geopolitically, you need a very high level of consensus on the higher level in order to be able to make progress in this field. And so Korea has been leading the way. But as to the efficacy of Korea's participation, we still need to see of how effective Seoul was. So we believe that when there is an infection, it can turn into a disaster, and this can turn into a public health crisis. When an infectious disease becomes a disaster, we have 4 different stages. And the stages are preparedness, prevention, recovery, and response. And this is a very textbook response. And I think that these 4 stages represent an area of research, an area of investment, if we were to build a global health security system and network. And let's take a look at what we would need to consider specifically for these different stages and domains. What is key would be, of course, to control and prevent the disease from spreading. And then you would have the medical stage, which would involve treatment. What is key is to prevent an infectious disease from becoming a disaster. And you can have a 4-stage metrics to stop an infectious disease from becoming a disaster. And this table is not somebody's research result. Rather, it is an accumulation of what has happened in the past as countries have responded to diseases. So let's take a quick look at the preventative stage. You need to be able to monitor the disease, and you need to be able to identify the vulnerable population. You need to predefine the vulnerable group. And you also need a master plan for disaster prevention and control. After a patient occurs, then you need to engage in patient surveillance, and you also need to be able to care for high at-risk patients, those who have chronic diseases, underlying conditions. And we also need to be able to care for special patients, for instance, people who have a certain disability or people who are with child. In terms of preparedness at the disease prevention and control level, we need to be able to have the resources and programs developed in advance, and we need to have the protocols in place. How are we going to predict just how far this infectious disease can spread? How are we going to secure the space that would be needed? And also, reward and compensation is important as well. A lot of unnecessary social conflict can arise if you have an institutionalized reimbursement program. And of course, we also need to think about parity setting. Who is going to get what type of vaccination first? And if this is institutionalized, it makes it that easier. And of course, in the medical side, you also need the facilities and the manpower. And let's say the event occurred, then that's when you go to the response stage. And in that case, you have to have the technology to eliminate the contaminated points. You also need to have quarantine guidelines and how you're going to manage the quarantine population. And in the event of a pandemic, then you need to have a home care plan in terms of the medical domain, because not everybody will be able to be admitted to a medical facility. Also, you need to think about triage, you need to think about temporary treatment facilities, and you need to analyze the treatment effect. And sometimes when you take the existing clinical analysis route, it will take 3 years. So in an event of a sudden pandemic, then you need special guidelines as well. And when it comes to recovery will take a long time, so you need the necessary rules and legislations in place. You also need the technology and plan to respond to variants. And you also need to manage patient cohorts. For instance, you need to track the patients, see what kind of side effects there are, and sometimes you might need rehabilitation. Having an infectious disease, it can have a psychological impact on the patient, so you need to provide psychological support. You need the manpower to manage these patients as well. In 2005, Korea consulted with Korea and China, and each of these points were dealt with as agenda topics. And we shared best practice models regarding each of these different points. And this is a type of practical, hands-on consultations we need to engage with other countries. And so here you can see slides detailing what we need to do in each of the different steps. Here you have prevention and preparedness. What is quite contentious right now is a facility exclusively for infectious diseases. During the MERS outbreak, there was a consensus that such a facility is needed, but now there is discussion on whether this is really needed. So we need a lot of discussion, and we need a lot of research. The same goes for personal protection gear as well. Right now, we use masks, and the medical personnel actually have more personal gear. But depending on what type of new infectious diseases, we may need to have goggles that are ready to be distributed. Sometimes some diseases are waterborne, and if the disease is waterborne, then the personal gear needed would be different as well. And as for the temporary patient facilities, right now, we do not have a lot of legal and institutional grounding. So if you are in the facility, what are the patient's rights? What happens if the patient dies at the facilities? This has to be cleared out as well. And there are also issues that need to be resolved in the recovery phase as well. But I'm sure all of you here are experts and you probably know better than me. But it's actually quite difficult because there's the issue of the two Koreas and issues related to Korea, Japan, and as well as other Northeast Asian and Southeast Asian countries. Biosecurity issue is an important issue because the disease can spread within hours because of the close proximity. But cooperation and consultation with neighboring countries is very difficult because there are already so much conflict. So cooperation or overcoming challenges in the bio sector is very difficult. If you look at the IHR that is imposed by WHO, however, only 20% of countries comply with the IHR. The US does not comply with the IHR. And as I mentioned earlier, East Asia represents a peculiar problem because the population density is very high. On the other hand, in this area, the countries are relatively close when it comes to disease information. And then furthermore, there's a lot of diplomatic and political conflict, especially in three countries in Northeast Asia, Korea, Japan, and Korea. And also, inter-Koreas, the two Koreas also have issues as well. For instance, one of the biggest problems is the gap in the global health security between the two Koreas. Just by looking at the score and rank that South Korea and North Korea take, you can see the difference. For instance, North Korea is 185th out of some 200 countries, while Korea ranks in the top 10. So in developing a program and implementing a program for global health security between the two Koreas, it's a very difficult task because of this gap. And so we need a Korean Peninsula Global Health Security Treaty. And what has been discussed so far is to limit this treaty to non-military and non-political subjects. And people agree that we should select a priority, and we need to revise domestic law and also sign international treaties. But there has not been much progress made in a inter-Korean treaty for health security. During the inter-Korean summit at Pyongyang, if you look at the joint statement, the two Koreas agreed to strengthen cooperation in the field of disease prevention control and health and medicine, but this was rather a declarative agreement, and we need to make a lot more efforts to build systems to make this possible. If you look at some of the laws, we could include an article or a chapter on global health security cooperation between the two Koreas. But some of the laws that are in place are not being revised, and some lawmakers are having difficulties enacting new laws to support this type of cooperation. And we might need an organization dedicated to the exchange and cooperation of health security issues among the two Koreas. First, I would like to mention that everybody agrees that health security issues are important, but what we are going to do and how we are going to about in achieving this is everybody has different opinions. And I would like to say that we need institutional reforms, and we need to revise domestic law, and we also need to apply this by phases.
Thank you, Professor Shin Sang-do. You talked about a very timely issue. I'm sure you know that because of the recent COVID pandemic, not only the two Koreas, but also countries across the world are trying to establish global governance for cooperation. This has become a critical issue globally, and Professor Shin has touched upon a cooperation in terms of health system between the two Koreas. So that was a wonderful presentation. So if you have any questions with regards to the presentation, please leave them through the chat function, and we will address them during the Q&A session. Our next presenter is Professor Choi Gang-seok. His presentation is titled Measures to Build One Health Response Cooperation for the Infectious Diseases on the Korean Peninsula. So his presentation is also related to biosecurity, which is a very timely and time-appropriate subject. As introduced, my name is Choi Gang-seok. So I'm going to talk about One Health today. So it's a concept related to health security. So One Health is about nature and farm animals and humans. And their health are dynamically intertwined with each other. And we must seek for a solution to that end. So that's what One Health is about. So the importance of One Health is immense. Many people have recognized the importance of One Health and tried to come up with implementation measures, but still there are a lot of things that are lacking. So the WHO and FAO and the World Animal Health organizations, these big global organizations are seeking for cooperation in terms of One Health. New infectious diseases and also we have the problem of other problems as well, rabies and so on. And as we experience COVID-19, is the One Health system really functioning properly? This is something that we need to think about. And how can One Health concept be applied to the Korean Peninsula and become functional? I would like to touch that in my presentation. So with COVID-19, new viruses carried by wild animals are threatening the sustainability of humankind. COVID-19 was actually a painful reminder of that. So, it's not about the human health anymore, but it's about livestock health. Livestock health is something that we need to put a great amount of importance on. So, although there have been a lot of discussions on the pandemic, but entering into the 21st century, there was something called the Avian Influenza and the ASF, which impacted the world. So it was an animal origin infectious disease that impacted the world and lowered the quality of life for many people and brought about food crisis as well. So highly pathogenic avian influenza is something that I mentioned earlier, and not only that, but also ASF, but COVID are all infectious diseases carried by wild animals. The virus brought about a pandemic in the Eurasian region, and their characteristics, this kind of characteristics, is that we don't know the exact time when these diseases came from the wild to humans. When did that carry over to humans? We cannot spot the time exactly. And another attribute is that these diseases are irreversible and that they wreak havoc on our society and economy. So in case of the bird flu or avian influenza, wild migratory birds are the carriers. And they impacted poultry in the Eurasia region. And the African swine flu was carried by a wild boar. And that actually impacted the pig industry in the region. And the common feature of these diseases is that they did not break out on the Korean Peninsula, but neighboring regions of the Korean Peninsula. But nevertheless, they impacted the peninsula. So in case of the bird flu, I think it was back in 2005, right? In a lake in China, wild migratory birds were infected, and every year these birds would travel across the Eurasian region, wreaking havoc on the poultry industry. And last year, actually, of migratory birds brought in avian influenza to Korea as well. So it gave us a great damage. And it does not just occur here in South Korea, but we can surmise that there were cases of avian influenza in North Korea as well. Now to ASF. So, as you can see from its name, African swine flu. So this is a disease that is indigenous to the African continent. So when it was spread to near the Mediterranean region, that signaled the beginning of a pandemic. And ASF not only influenced South Korea but also North Korea. So the two Koreas experienced a lot of difficulties in terms of their pig industry. So, like I said before, these infectious diseases are, Korean Peninsula is not responsible for these diseases, but it is not free from the impact of these diseases, and the impact is rather severe. The damages that are incurred by these diseases not just impact the owners of the farms, but it also impacts the food industry that makes use of these animals. And especially in the case of North Korea, pig industry is an important source of income for small families. So therefore, the impact of Asian swine flu would be felt at a greater level by North Koreans. So there have been already 3 outbreaks of African swine flu in Korea this year. The virus was carried by wild boars. So, although there have been some government measures to prevent these diseases, especially focusing on areas where the outbreak of swine flu occurs the most, it still nevertheless impacted South Korea. And in North Korea, ASF actually officially broke out in the Chagang province area. But if you actually look at the related data closely, this issue was very severe in North Korea. This is an unofficial piece of data, but this disease, African swine flu, is something that is very difficult to contain. As a matter of fact, it was never wiped out completely or eradicated completely in countries that experience ASF. And like I said before, it is usually the wild boars that carry the disease. In terms of avian influenza, last year in Korea there were outbreaks of the bird flu which damaged the poultry industry. So that actually led to a lack of supply of eggs, which actually made the price of eggs go up significantly. So although we don't have any official reports of North Korea experiencing bird flu, we do see, as you can see in this newspaper article, that North Korea probably did experience bird flu. So there are a lot of farms in North Korea that raise ducks and geese. And ducks and geese are vulnerable bird flu, but they don't die easily. And the reason why this becomes a bigger problem in North Korea is that they raise these ducks and geese not in farms, but they just let them roam free, which means that they can contact wild birds, which would carry the diseases outside of North Korea. So, as a matter of fact, last year we have seen a significant number of cases of bird flu, and we are pretty sure that North Korea was not an exception to this phenomenon. So, given that, a livestock epidemic is not a problem of the farms anymore, but it is a health issue that is directly linked to the health of our citizens and also to food security. And to resolve such issue, we need to look into the veterinary quarantine system of both South and North Korea. And when we look into those systems closely, we will be able to see the differences and gaps. So we would need to resolve that matter as well going forward. So with regards to animal infectious diseases, how can we cooperate and find solutions to this issue? First of all, we have to take into account the stark difference in the structure of livestock industry between the two Koreas. Usually, our livestock are mostly comprised of cow, pig, and chicken. But in North Korea, like I said before, in South Korea, we do raise these cows and pigs on a massive scale, but North Korea, together with that, also raises animals like goats and rabbits that can easily be raised at homes. And this difference actually makes a significant impact with regards to animal epidemic, because this actually poses differences in the structure of livestock industry between the two Koreas, and we would have to take into account this difference when we try to cooperate with each other. And let's look at the national veterinary quarantine system of the two Koreas. So while the veterinary quarantine structure is very similar, so for example, in South Korea, the policy is set by the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, and the detailed plans are designed by Animal and Plant Quarantine Agency, which is under the auspices of the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, and the animal hygienic labs of the metropolitan and basic local government to execute those plans. As for North Korea, its structure is quite similar. So policy is established by the Korean Workers' Party, and the detailed plans are set up by the Office of Veterinary Quarantine of the Ministry of Agriculture. So that's a counterpart of South Korea's Animal and Plant Quarantine Agency. And the plans are executed by so-called veterinary preventive stations. So when we look at the quarantine system and its structure, they look pretty much the same on the outside. But with a deepened economic crisis in North Korea, it probably lacks funds and necessary facilities and devices to actually properly defend against these infectious diseases. So this is a real-life problem. And next, I would like to touch upon each Korea's capability to diagnose such livestock epidemic. So although there are no official data, we can nevertheless collect data from various news outlets and so on. As you can see on the left, so that's the lab of South Korea. On the right, that's the lab of North Korea. You can see the stark difference. Just the ambience of the room and the devices that they have and so on. So this is a real life issue. And because there is this gap, to swiftly diagnose, so in order to prevent these diseases from spreading, we need to take rapid and quick measures as soon as there is an outbreak of a disease. But because of this gap in our capability to diagnose this epidemic, we face some difficulties. So this also needs to be taken into consideration when we facilitate inter-Korean cooperation. So for Korea, we have about 500 new vets that every year. And as for North Korea, they have about 300 new vets every year. So North Korea does have enough people with expertise. But because of this lack of facility and devices, so on, there's only so much the North Korean experts can do. So to solve this issue, the Moon administration has done a lot of different things. And in past administrations too, they did make attempts to resolve this problem through various measures. Nevertheless, North Korea has never really responded to a potential cooperation. So, and I'm sure that political relations and diplomacy really impact North Korea's responding to our proposal for cooperation. So yes, while it is true that we need to develop a joint disease control cooperation, but once there is an outbreak of a disease, I'm sorry, so let me reiterate. So one of the limitations that is given to us is that the cooperative body that might be established between the two Koreas might not function very well if it just responds to a disease that has already been broken out. So in terms of avian influenza and ASF, so from the experts' viewpoint, yes, they do have problems. And they do wreak havoc on North Korea. We are sure of that. But there is no official reports of North Korea experiencing these diseases. Only once did North Korea report a case of ASF outbreak. So North Korea probably wants to, I believe, hide this problem. So, and because we have taken So to date, we have taken some phased approaches to facilitate this cooperation, but that North Korea wants to hide this issue becomes an obstacle to us. So this isn't going to be easy. Lots of attempts have been made to curb this issue by many administrations, but we have not been able to make significant progress. So to approach this at a fundamental level, we have to establish a permanent consultative body for One Health response. So ASF and avian influenza. Yes, it is important to deal with these issues, but this animal epidemic is not going to be something that is one-off, but it's going to continue going forward. So with that in mind, when we want to establish a biosecurity in Korea, we need to make or establish a necessary related facilities or a consultative body for One Health. So while it is important that we resolve these issues as quickly as we can, fundamentally we would have to establish a One Health system where we would have a monitoring system of each other, and through that we will share information And once there is an outbreak of a disease, we will share that swiftly so as to predict the spread of this disease and to prevent it. So we would have to cooperate in terms of quarantine measures, and by doing so, we will be able to control the disease. So this is the ideal way to approach this. But the problem is we have never been able to make a progress towards the next step. So then what are some challenges that we are facing today? The biggest challenge, first of all, is the lack of transparency of disease information in each country. So we will have to make conditions for related information to be shared transparently. If we do not share information, there would not be cooperation at all. And so we have to enhance transparency. And World Health Organizations and World Animal Organizations, when they cooperate with developing countries, this is the first thing that they require from the developing countries, enhancing transparency so that we can deal with the issue. So the reporting itself needs to be transparent as well. So I've been an expert of animal diseases for a long time, and I've provided technical assistance to Northeast Asia and Africa. And if you look at the situation there, we can surmise what the situation is in North Korea. First of all, we identify the diseases and monitor them. And for that, we need system and resources. But in reality, the problem stems from the fact that there are no such system and resources in place. The developing just countries, when they see a livestock die, they just say, oh, it must be this and this disease. But we can never know for sure because there's no transparency of sharing of information. And that's actually related to lack of technical capability as well. So that's something that we need to deal with. So that could be led by the government or by the civil society and so on. We can think about a lot of ways to do this. And the second precondition is sustainability. So we are at an advantageous position. And it's not about us providing assistance, but this system actually needs to be mutually beneficial to both South and North Korea. And in order for that to be mutually beneficial, we should not be problem solvers, but we should help North Korea establish a system through which it can become the problem solver. And based on that, we would be able to guarantee independence from political structure. So of course, it's going to be difficult for us for this system to be entirely independent from some aspects of the government, like diplomacy and so on, but it should not be confined to the political structure because infectious disease need to be perceived as public goods. And alleviating problems related to this public goods is mutually beneficial, and therefore we should work on this together. This is the kind of mindset that we need to have. And we have to take the integrated approach based on the idea of One Health. So, it will be a fragmentary approach for us to say that we would just deal with the farm animals alone and that's it. But when we look at ASF, yes, control at farms is important, but at the same time, we need to consider the wild. We need to manage risks that break out in the wild. So therefore, an integrated approach based on the idea of One Health is important. And as Professor Shin mentioned earlier, cooperation with international organizations is also highly important. This is another problem that we should solve in a long term, especially with regards to human resources and finances and so on. So my presentation was fairly general because there are limits to what we can specifically do with regards to this plan. So it was very difficult for me to suggest some concrete ideas. But I just gave you a big picture of the strategy that we can take going forward. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Professor Che. And Professor Shin talked about people. He focused on people in his presentation, and Professor Che focused on animals in his presentation. He talked about measures to build response cooperation for infectious diseases of animals. So is the name One Health coined by you, or is this an existing term? Yes, it's an existing term. Internationally, this term has been used for decades. And with the outbreak of new infectious diseases these days, the concept of One Health has become institutionalized in a lot of countries. So in 2003, when there was an international outbreak of SARS, and when we realized that the origin of these infectious diseases were from the wild, we began to come up with the concept of One Health. Yeah, I majored in politics, so I'm not well versed in the veterinary studies or medical studies, and so it was my first time hearing about this concept of One Health. But it was very interesting. So medicine and veterinary medicine have a lot to offer to us. And what is discussed at a political studies can be integrated with what is talked about in medical studies, I believe. And now over to Mr. Im Yo-han, Professor Im Yo-han. Could you give us a comment about Professor Shin's presentation?
감사합니다.
Thank you very much. I think COVID can be the exception, but as you've heard, infectious diseases know no borders. Infectious disease does not care if countries are hostile towards each other or amicable toward each other. What is important, therefore, is to respond jointly. I am a medical doctor, but I have to make some political comments regarding North Korea. North Korea has U.S. sanctions and UN sanctions levied against it, and China also opens and closes its borders at will, and North Korea itself has closed the borders due to COVID. I think the Unification Ministry of South Korea is continuously seeking ways to assist North Korea and help, but there are grave limitations, and I really want to make that very clear. It's almost impossible to cooperate with North Korea or help North Korea. All the sanctions and the COVID pandemic at the border of China and North Korea. In the Hippocrates Declaration oath, you are supposed to help even your enemy. And under the UN principle, you have to clearly delineate humanitarian assistance from political circumstances. But the UN itself is taking perhaps a contradictory stance by imposing sanctions on North Korea and blocking humanitarian aid. Professor Shin gave a very good presentation, and through Dr. Che's presentation, I was able to learn a lot about the ASF.
원칙을 오늘 우리 최 교수님께서
Dr. Choi,
자기도 모르게
I
강조를
think he ended up really emphasizing one principle.
시스템이 같다. 그건 몰랐습니다.
I did not know that we had a similar system with the veterinary medicine.
저희는 보건성하고 일을 많이 해요. 우선
We collaborated a lot with the health department quite often. If you want to collaborate and cooperate within the health sector, you need to have similar systems. When we helped North Korea with cases of tuberculosis in the past, we had to go through the health Department of North Korea, what kind of health system they had, how many hospitals they had, what kind of screening systems they had in place. If you want to help North Korea, you need to accommodate the system that North Korea has. You cannot enforce and force something that is not there. Our idea of helping may be extraordinary, but if it does not accommodate their system, it's no use. We cannot, again, force our system onto North Korea.
이제는 인권 중에
And among the different human rights, there is what is now called the right to health. What is different between South and North Korea
그건 전염병 문제가 아직 굉장히 심한
is that in North Korea, usually infectious diseases are an issue, and in South Korea, cardiovascular or chronic conditions are a bigger problem. So that is the biggest difference between the North and South.
최 교수님은 이제 데이터
Dr. Choi mentioned some data,
통계를
but
수집해서 낼 수 있는
North Korea does not have the capability to collect data and create statistical data.
일을 쓰고 있다. 아마.
And I think that sometimes it may be too early for us to be able to make decisions based on the little data they have. And lastly, with regards to COVID,
코비드에 관한
it may be something quite explosive to say. If you look at how the COVID pandemic unfolded, and a lot of people have their eyes on Wuhan, but if you look at the initial literature on COVID-19,
그 실험했던 위험한 코로나
the laboratory
시험에도 미국 노스캐롤라이나에서
that carried out dangerous tests with COVID-19, in fact, had received a lot of funding from a U.S. institution in North Carolina. So I don't think it's fair for us to place the blame entirely on China. The U.S. ended up carrying out experiments and tests that was difficult to carry out on its own territory in China, essentially, by funding this lab. We do not know when the two Koreas will achieve unification. We do not know when the two Koreas will be able to engage in further cooperation. But when it comes to health issues, I think we need to engage in cooperation to lessen the health security risk both in both Koreas. I think that cooperation is possible, but what is quite unfortunate is that currently humanitarian assistance and exchange is near impossible now. And this is to no fault of South Korean government. I think that the Unification Ministry is really doing the best that it can at this point. I really want to emphasize that we should not engage in cooperation with North Korea because of its regime. I want to say that we need to create policies aimed at the North Korean residents, not the regime. If you look at the economy of North Korea, it is 1/50th, 1/100th of South Korea. So because we have the capability and the luxury, I think we need to embrace the North. And I think that is where we will find the solution and answer to these issues.
Thank you, Professor In Yo-han, for your insightful comments. Next, I would like to invite Professor Kim Sang-bae to give us some comments. I think you could probably have a very different point of view than other speakers, because maybe you can talk about this issue from a viewpoint of international politics. Thank you. So I really enjoyed the two presentations. They were very detailed and thorough, and I was able to learn a lot. The shock brought about by COVID-19 is so great that we here at the institute that I work on, we have held like large-scale conferences and did related researches, and we're trying to make our papers into a book. And a lot of international politics researchers, when we gather together, we usually talk about the traditional security, right? And my role is to go to them that yes, there are traditional security issues and threats like war and all that, but there are new emerging security issues like diseases, and we're living in such a world. And that's the kind of discussion that we're having these moments. And listening to the two presentations and comments of Professor Linton, I thought that maybe we might have to switch roles. So of course, security is very important when it comes to medicine and veterinary medicine and so on. But perhaps we will have to switch roles. So after looking at Professor Shin's presentation, you used the phrase health security. So
usually, people who discuss states use 안보, the Korean word for security. Other sectors like IT use 보안. Sometimes they use 안전, the Korean word, which means safety, when they translate security. So when it comes to political scientists and IT experts, somebody says cybersecurity, other people say system safety or system security. And I think that Professor Shin has linked the issues of health with security, and I think that it means that we need to look at health securities from a national security perspective. I think that it would be helpful if you can give us a little bit more background on why it is called health security, because sometimes terminology is quite important. I guess the crux is how we are going to connect health and security. I think that's what his research is about. If you look like health issues, infections, and pathogens, I think in the traditional security sense, these issues were very important in terms of biological work or biological terrorism. And so it was considered important in the realm of intentional attack. It could be conducted by a state actor or a non-state actor. 10 to 12 years ago, when there was a lot of heightened interest about terrorism, that was when this sort of bio attacks was also important as well. But now you're talking about natural factors, naturally occurring bio threats. Perhaps a threat is not appropriate, and rather we would have to use the word risk. I think that perhaps we are living in an era where the two coexist. Recently, international politics is concerned and interested in why perhaps we need to merge the new concepts of security with traditional concepts of security. Right now, there's a dichotomy of traditional security and non-traditional security. And recently, if you look at the discourse in the academia, a lot of academics and scholars feel that perhaps these two different concepts of security should be merged together. In the past, these seemingly disconnected events and incidents, like a village getting an infectious disease, was considered quite separate. But now that these issues are actually threatening national security, it seems that things have changed also. Social uncertainty, economic uncertainty, these are all linked to political issues and to national security. And recently, if you look at Korea, an economic crisis is brewing because of how we are going to compensate small business owners in the face of a pandemic. So scholars are realizing that these issues could lead to a source of conflict between states. U.S. and China are engaged in sort of a conflict regarding who is to blame for the occurrence of COVID-19. On the global scale, the two countries are in competition for hegemony. And these issues that don't seem really like security issues or seem like very minor issues, they can be bred into larger issues that affect national security. So these issues are all on a continuum. And if that is the case, perhaps we need to change our view of things. Instead of having this dichotomy of intentional attacks and natural attacks, perhaps this all needs to come under the same research and academic umbrella. And I think that in this sense, we need to develop the concepts as well. I think the panelists here and the social scientists need to come together to develop these concepts and evolve these concepts.
So let me make a brief comment about the presentation. So what was really impressive is that in the medical field, the veterinary medical field, how do you go about responding to the problems? And you talked about the specifics of the response problems. About this. You talked about prevention, preparation, response, and recovery, and so on. And looking at all of that, it made me realize that a lot of researches have been conducted in this area and that we're well prepared for it. So this response system is very different from the response system against traditional threats. So because this kind of medical response system, of course, cannot be the same as a system against war, for example. So, and on the Korean Peninsula and as well as Northeast Asia, how can we effectively build such a system? That remains as a task and question for us. As you mentioned earlier, our normal response is that given the characteristics of Northeast Asia, the political and military cooperation is not well facilitated. So we call that the hard power politics, hard security area is something that is very difficult to overcome and to resolve the issues that surround it. So, but we still need to find solutions that go beyond borders. So, from the area of the soft power or soft politics, we ought to seek for some countermeasures. And maybe that could ease some military tension on Northeast Asia. Maybe we, sometimes we talked about the so-called functionalist approach. But actually, this kind of discussion was made like 10, 20 years ago, but even today, it's not being realized very yet. So we could perhaps turn this issue around. And maybe the reason why we cannot garner political cooperation is because of the other thing, and it's not the other way around. So whether it's a Korea and Japan or Korea, China, Japan that experiences confrontation, they all are well aware of the issues that we commonly face, but the old disputes are still getting in their way of establishing a cooperative system. So we can, if we cooperate, then we can, the experience of one country can spill over to another. And we need to consider these issues from an integrated point of view. So the structural problems, geopolitical problems faced by Northeast Asia ought to go together with the establishment of this system. And so medical field, the veterinary field, and international political field must ought to cooperate all together to this end. Nevertheless, Korea's national power and status in the global arena, when we take all that into consideration, we can play a more active and leading role in the medical area and the quarantine area. We are not a developing country anymore. But then we have a long way before us before we can say that we are truly an advanced country. But I guess we can say we are a middle power, at least. And as we raise our prestige even further on the global arena, yes, it's important that we solve our own issue, but we must have a mindset that other people's problems are our own problems too. And we need to take responsibility to contribute to resolving international problems. The global health security regime that Mr. Shin talked about earlier, I could mention that, in which Korea played a role. And in responding to COVID-19 these days, Korea has made some significant achievements globally. And there are a lot of things that Korea can contribute to international community going forward. And when we go back to the realm of politics, after the launch of divided administration, the focus of international politics has shifted from nationalism to international norm, values, and ideology, and so on. So if you look at the history of international politics, are we going to promote the norms, or are we going to promote that is to our own benefit? It goes back and forth and so on. But now it's shifting more towards promoting the international norms and orders and so on. And, even if I experience some losses, I am willing to make contributions to resolve global issues. This is the kind of attitude that we have to assume. And our experience that we built up in responding to COVID-19 can be a great asset for us in terms of diplomacy. So that's another thing that we should take into account. So thank you for listening to my comment. Thank you very much, Professor. You gave us some very great inputs. I would like to give just a short time to each presenter to make their replies with regards to the comments and questions. But before that, let me take a look at the platform to check whether there are some online questions. I don't think there are any, but I have a question of my own, as a matter of fact. So the two professors talked about, not just in medical field and veterinary field, there is a great gap between the two Koreas. So, but even though there is that great gap, it's not that South Korea should make a unilateral support to North Korea, because North Korea could be repulsed at the idea. So it should not. The cooperation should not be realized in the form of aid, but in the form of mutual cooperation. So I believe that's very important. So when we talk about mutual cooperation, is there something that North Korea can give to us? Because if this relation has to be a win-win relationship, we have to give something to North Korea, but we also have to get something in return. And that would help us also garner public support in terms of cooperation with North Korea. That it's not just a unilateral support towards North Korea, but cooperating with North Korea is actually a plus for us as well. So, how can we emphasize the aspect of mutual cooperation? What are some comparative advantages that North Korea has over us?
그런 부분을 실마리로 해서 남북 협력의 고리를
Because you said that that can actually be the starting point or the key to inter-Korean cooperation. So can you talk about that? And with this question, can you two also respond to the comments given by the discussants?
예, 저는 뭐 인요한 교수님 워낙 오랫동안 운동에 듣고 선생님
I was actually a student of Professor In, and he has played a pivotal role in helping and cooperating with North Korea. We have sanctions from the UN and US against North Korea, and the border shutdowns are impacting North Korea. This is true. Health security, the concept of health security actually was born in the process of the U.S. classifying different threats to its national security. And in the process of classifying terrorism and other threats, the threats that could be posed by health risks were identified. And the reason why it's delineated from traditional security is because when it comes to health security, the enemy is not humans or a state, so we have a common goal to work towards. I think that is the biggest difference. Of the comments that were made, I think we need to acknowledge the difference between the two Koreas and identify what kind of mutual contributions can be made. I think opening data and cooperating is a benefit in itself, but I'm sure North Korea has other benefits. I think what is important is that although South Korea is advanced in terms of technology and knowledge and financial resources, however, human security is a new concept. So both North and South Korea have to work together to develop the personnel needed to deal with health security responses. If you go to North Korea, they do have quality medical personnel, professionals, and they do have hospitals. So I think we share the mandate of fostering professionals, and I think we need to cooperate because, for instance, I think that we need or we can cooperate in developing human resources. And sometimes we may need the help of the medical professionals that we train that are from North Korea because a communicable disease might spread in South Korea first. And we also need to share data and information and best cases, and that can be mutually beneficial.
Yes, Professor Che? Yes, I am of a similar opinion. For our relationship to be mutually beneficial, we need to view this issue as a public good. So this is actually related to security related to public good on the Korean Peninsula. And what could be the foundation of that for to raise the awareness that this is a public good? The experts or the veterinarians in both Koreas would have their capabilities reinforced. So if we can reinforce the capability of North Korea's vets, that they would be able to make great contributions in curbing the diseases among livestock. And as for South Korea, so whether it be avian influenza or ASF, a lot of these diseases come from the north. So by helping North Korean vets to improve their capability, we would be able to detect in advance what diseases are being broken out on the northern part of the country and make response measures. So that would be the mutual benefiting factor. And in terms of research and development, yes, there is a significant gap between the two countries. In case of North Korea, it usually uses it conducts a lot of researches using the plants that grow indigenously in North Korea to make cures and medicines and so on, where they use a traditional method, whereas here in South Korea we create new medicines based on new technologies like vaccines and so on. And if we can cooperate in the research and development area, we might be able to create something that is unique and new. Yes, thank you for that comment. Professor Linton or Professor Kim, do you have the other comments?
10 years ago, we held a seminar on tuberculosis at the Sariwan. So we had experts from Pyongyang, and we had experts from the U.S., and we also had people from the local community. But what was surprising, I think, was that of course, it's difficult for them to get their hands on the latest literature, but they were impeccable professionals. And so we need to do away with this notion that we have to teach them something. And I think when it comes to Eastern Oriental medicine, they are actually ahead of South Korea because they know or they have made a lot of attempts to bring science into Oriental medicine. And so they have done a lot to identify the components or the chemicals inside traditional Oriental medicine. And so they have made a lot of efforts to identify scientifically what is in traditional Oriental medicine. And we built them an operation theater. And it was really nothing, but as soon as the facility was available, they were very fast in terms of learning the technology and the medical procedures that had to do at the time with a spinal operation. So objectively speaking, the Billy Graham Organization Foundation was part of this initiative, and they said that when you do the same project in Africa, more than 90% of the facilities or what they have provided was not working. But when you come to North Korea a year later, more than 95% is actually working. So I think that we should not underestimate the capability of the North Korean professionals. And if you ignore them or if you do not respect them, you cannot make anything happen. That last comment actually made a very lasting impression. You are right. I think that we need to respect them and respect their esteem that they have as North Koreans. And I think that even in South Korea, nobody really wants to engage in sort of a unilateral assistance. A lot of people think that the ideal way to go is a mutual cooperation in which both sides can win.
Professor Kim Sang-bae, if you would. Yeah, I don't think we have a lot of time, so let me just give you some short comments. So the risk in health security is related to a lot of things, and it will grow into a political and diplomatic problems. And with regards to Professor Choi's presentation, while conducting researches on COVID-19, what problem would this be linked to in the future? Because that was a question that we were all thinking about, because that would bring about a greater problem. For example, like food security problem or energy issue. So if the COVID pandemic is linked to food or energy crisis in the future, that would bring about some big problems. And we don't see signs of that yet, but we were talking about that. But when it comes to inter-Korean relations and problems, of course, that might look a little different because we don't have any official data coming from North Korea, but I probably surmise that North Korea is experiencing some severe food and energy problems. And one thing I would like to tell Professor Shin is that from a political point of view, we talk a lot about division and unification. Two-thirds of the time, our talks are on division and unification. And so, unification has to happen from a political and military point of view. Because the unification issue remains, we are not making progress in many other things. So, just one inter-Korean summit would lead to a breakthrough in some of these issues, but sometimes that's not the case. So, these issues that are occurring in our daily lives actually require your unification. That thought came to me as I listened to your presentation. So the medical system of the two Koreas are divided, and their technologies are divided, and our medical personnel are divided. So later, even if we do achieve unification at a political and military level, we will still be divided in terms of our lifestyle. And so another risk might come to us. So, we're trying to look at the big picture when we deal with this problem, but at a micro level, we do not really consider this problem in depth. So maybe you can kind of comment on that, probably make some suggestions on what we should focus on when we approach this problem on a micro level. Well, actually, we are out of time, so the last question given by Professor Kim Sang-baek can be addressed at a later date, I'm pretty sure. As we heard earlier, to forge a win-win relations and cooperation among the two Koreas would be an important task going forward. So I talked about this issue in some other occasions. So last year, there are a lot of outbreaks of malaria in the border area. So the statistics is correct, Professor Che, right? Yes, there are lots of cases of malaria. And the reason is because there was not a joint effort made by two Koreas in terms of preventive and quarantine measures, I heard. So it's not just, so we have seen a surge in the number of malaria patients this year. And therefore, we must cooperate with each other to prevent or deal against our common enemy, I guess you could say. So once a zoonosis becomes a pandemic, for example, these viruses that are carried by migratory birds, if we think about that scenario, a cooperation between the two Koreas is a must. We have to have that system in place to respond against zoonosis. So before that scenario actually becomes realized, we have to come up with ways and pull on wisdom together to prevent that from happening. So this session was actually a prelude, I guess you can say, or preparatory steps towards more concrete talks that can be done related to this area. If you don't have any further questions, we would like to wrap up the session for today. Thank you very much.